When speaking at the United Nations General Assembly, U.S. President Biden said when talking about relations with China that the United States does not seek conflict with China, nor does it seek decoupling from China. Prior to this, high-level interactions between China and the United States continued to heat up. Blinken, Yellen, Kerry, and Raimondo visited China one after another. U.S. National Security Advisor Sullivan also met with Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Malta. In the eyes of the outside world, the Biden administration is adjusting and repairing relations with China, and hopes to obtain China's cooperation or support in solving domestic inflation crisis, debt crisis, and other issues. In August 2022, U.S. President Biden signed and passed the so-called CHIP Act, which supports semiconductor manufacturers in conducting R&D and production in the United States, while restricting companies that receive subsidies from expanding production capacity in China. There are reports that China's exports of key raw materials for gallium and germanium chips dropped to zero in August. In this regard, a reporter asked at the press conference of the Ministry of Commerce of China whether China has verified and issued export licenses to some companies. The answer was that China has approved some compliance applications in accordance with regulations, and some companies are already able to export gallium and germanium. China will continue to approve applications from compliant companies. According to public information, China is a major exporter of gallium and germanium, the key raw materials for chips. Its output accounts for 90% and 70% of the global semiconductor market respectively, far ahead of other countries, and it occupies an absolute dominant position in the semiconductor raw material industry. As dual-use items for both military and civilian use, gallium and germanium play prominent roles in fields such as chips, photovoltaics, and special materials, and have irreplaceable roles. China's export controls on the export of gallium and germanium will help it be used to endanger China's national security. The Ministry of Commerce requires them to submit information on the destination and use of products when exporting, which increases China's ability to control the supply chain. This will, to a large extent, prevent the gallium and germanium exported from China from being used in areas that endanger China's national security, and ensure the normal supply to legal and compliant enterprises to the greatest extent. Some people point out that the United States can decide which countries in the semiconductor industry chain to export related products to and which countries not to export. Naturally, China also has the right to decide to implement effective controls on the export of key raw materials for chips. For example, it will be difficult for those U.S. arms regions that support the evildoers and actively promote arms sales to Taiwan to obtain gallium and germanium from China. It can be said that in the U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, the U.S. government is only the final decision maker. They hope that through arms sales to Taiwan, the Taiwan authorities will be more willing to obey their orders, and ultimately achieve the goal of using Taiwan to contain China. Of course, the U.S. government also needs support from arms companies. After all, votes and financial support from military-industrial interest groups are needed in elections. However, considering political needs, the U.S. government may not necessarily want to sell weapons to Taiwan at any time, because they also have to consider the reaction of mainland China. Arms dealers are different. As long as they have a backlog of goods, they want to sell them as quickly as possible, and the more, the better. Therefore, they have played the most active role in promoting arms sales to Taiwan. This is why the mainland wants to emphasize that China will definitely impose sanctions on Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Grumman that are involved in arms sales to Taiwan. As an old Chinese saying goes, harming others will ultimately harm yourself. The above three U.S. military-industrial companies will have difficulty obtaining supplies of gallium and germanium from China. In addition, U.S. high-tech companies have huge demand for gallium and germanium. For U.S. companies such as Intel, NVIDIA, and Qualcomm, China's export controls on chip raw materials are like a sword that may fall at any time. Whether U.S. companies can obtain gallium and germanium in the future depends entirely on how they correctly view China's development and handle their relations with China. Currently, the United States is in deep economic trouble, and the Biden administration hopes to improve relations with China in order to gain China's cooperation and support. Out of the overall interests of Sino-US relations, China does not want Sino-US economic and trade relations to continue to deteriorate and actively promotes global economic vitality. To this end, China and the United States announced the establishment of economic and financial workers to negotiate on economic and trade issues. A month ago, during Raimondo's visit to China and the United States also agreed to establish a mutual reporting mechanism for export control information. It can be seen that China has always maintained great restraint and patience in the strategic game between China and the United States. However, as soon as China approved the export of chip raw materials, Biden immediately changed his mind and announced new regulations on chip export controls. It is reported that the Biden administration is preparing to release more than $52 billion in federal grants and tens of billions of dollars in tax credit subsidies. The new regulations stipulate that companies that receive subsidies from the U.S. CHIP Act are not allowed to conduct research and development and expand production capacity in the field of high-end chips in China within 10 years. For specialized chips involving artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and military fields, restrictions are more stringent, and violators will have their government subsidies revoked. It can be seen that although President Biden keeps claiming that he will not decouple from China, he is actually pressing forward step by step in an attempt to kick mainland China out of the semiconductor industry chain and curb China's development in order to ensure its monopoly in the semiconductor field and seize excess quotas. Profit. However, the actions of the United States will only force China to make up for its shortcomings in the semiconductor industry. Huawei's previous successful breakthrough in the chip field shows that Chinese chips have ushered in an important moment to turn crisis into opportunity. U.S. technology blockades and containment are completely bankrupt.